Hi, we move into Genesis 26 today, and before we enter into the immediate passage you see on the left side of your screen, I thought it'd be valuable to do this brief introductory video to situate Genesis 26 in its context, because we've already started the Jacob cycle, and I've already said that there is no Isaac cycle, as all scholars agree, and yet this chapter is all about Isaac, and there's no mention whatsoever of Jacob and Esau. There's barely any mention of Rebekah. So we have to look a little bit about what's going on here and how this chapter fits or doesn't fit into the Jacob story in which it's embedded and why it might be put there. Scholars who, in a traditional source criticism perspective, see this as from a different author or from a different time or juxtaposed from a different source, and none of that is necessary anymore to understand the story, as many recent scholars have shown. So as we've been looking in the introduction to the Jacob cycle, some of the same issues we looked at there on this chart are relevant here, including what is the relationship between this chapter and the rest of Genesis, and I could specify here the relationship with the rest of the Jacob story that we're in the midst of. The time and place of composition, is it different than the rest of the Jacob story? Its relation with the other parts of the Bible, and today we're going to see a very specific link to the story of David around the presence of the Philistines, and then the reading level, the question of the personal level or the international or intertextual level. And the ethics and morality continues to be an issue, but it's not so much in this chapter because those issues for most scholars are around the deceptive nature of Jacob. Although Isaac, his father, is certainly deceptive here in telling King Abimelech that Rebekah is his sister. And unlike Abraham, who could later claim that, well, Sarah was his half-sister, there's no claim at all that Rebekah is his sister at all. In fact, she's his cousin, as we know. So let's begin to look at some of the questions that lead us to wonder about this chapter. So as I showed in the keywords, and let's look at that briefly here, we can see clearly some of the overall pattern. So this introductory section here is an appearance of Yahweh to Isaac, and we'll look back at that again in a couple of minutes and see how that fits in. Then there's the so-called third wife-sister story, and notice in the keywords the highlight of the word woman here. As recent scholars have noted, it's not so much about the relationship between Abraham and Rebekah as the relationship between Isaac and Rebekah, as it is between Isaac and Abimelech, the king, and therefore she simply becomes a woman. And as we'll see in another minute, chiastically paralleled with the wells down in this paragraph here. And then more about Abimelech back here. Verses 1 to 25 form a little chiasm here, but not one that's simply around identical words in both places, but around the themes in an interesting way. So the framing is of the two theophanies, where Yahweh appears to Isaac and says in both, I will be with you and bless you. But the B parts, I suggest, is the parallel between the dispute over a woman, and as I've noted in the key words just now, you can see that's the focus rather than Rebekah as an individual. And on the other side of the chiasm, the dispute over wells. In both cases, over a female fertility symbol. Obviously, the woman as a symbol of the children who will come in this out-of-order story. The children have already come in the narrative, as we know, Jacob and Esau. But also the fertility of the wells, because Isaac's a farmer and needs those wells for his harvest that produces the wealth and power that makes the Philistines afraid of him. So that little chiasm shapes this section here. Out this whole section, we're going to see how much this is reinforcing what we already heard back in chapter 21 about Abraham's relationship both with Yahweh and with Abimelech. So let's look at that briefly here. We'll look more closely at it when we get into the individual details. But as all scholars have noted who have commented on this, we see the many parallels, which I've color-coded here, between chapter 21, 22 to 34, and sections of chapter 26. I only put part of it here because it's already longer than the other, and I didn't want it to be too small. You can barely see the whole thing there. There are some certain echoes that are clear. For example, we see here in 21, Abimelech says to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. And then we see directly Yahweh saying to Isaac, I will be with you and I will fulfill the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. And notice how much of what's in chapter 26 is echoing Abraham. I am the God of your father Abraham and I am with you. As we see, you are now the blessed of Yahweh. So in many ways, this scene with Abimelech and the wells, and which follows right after the previous wife-sister story in chapter 21, is the occasion for the writer to place Isaac as a direct successor to Abraham, to the covenant with Yahweh. But why choose this particular incident as an example? Why not, for example, just have the theophany up here of Yahweh's revealing Yahweh's self to Isaac and skip over all this stuff, or have some other things? We'll have to see that as we go. Another element that's key here, and it's related to the chiasm, as we'll see, is the role of wells. As I've been noting all along, all the way back here to the to the Hagar and Ishmael situation, wells throughout the Bible are female fertility symbols. It ought not to be surprising that the well is like a vagina in the sense that it contains moisture, and that moisture can become the source of life. And so internal situations like houses and wells are often considered female symbols, and exterior situations like fields and cities are considered male situations. In the fertility of the earth, the rain from the sky is the male symbol, and hence the male father sky god, and the soil is the vaginal symbol, and hence the earth mother goddess. In so many traditions, monotheism had to blend those into one, and hence in Genesis 1 we get to the image of God in Yahweh is male and female. But the wells remain female symbols. So much of what's going on here is a dispute over wells, and as we'll see when we get there, also a dispute over two ways of life, over the portrayal here of the Philistines not as iron-wielding warmongers, as shepherd-type people, in contrast with Isaac, who's the only farmer of the patriarchal line all the way in Genesis, and that will echo into the curse we saw in Genesis 3, where agriculture was the curse, which leads to the disputes over water, as we'll see. So a number of intra-textual connections here with the wells and with the original water situation back in chapter 2 and 3, where it wasn't a well, but water just simply springing up from the ground was available. Another thing that makes this chapter difficult is it seems to portray a Rebekah and Isaac over here, who we'll see, whom the king sees yitzhaking, which is translated as fondling, which is to say a young couple in love, and there's no sense of children around at all. There's no mention of Jacob and Esau, who we already saw are adults in the previous scene. So what we have to recognize is the timeline is out of order. It's not just chapter 6 that's out of order here, but two scenes we saw earlier. All three of these ones in red are in reverse order. So really what comes first here in the sequence, in the order in the text, is the scene we're seeing in chapter 26. Then after that, Jacob and Esau are born, and after that, Isaac and Ishmael bury their father Abraham. And at that point, Jacob and Esau are 15 years old. So they had a grandfather in Abraham during their lifetime, but there's no sense that they met at all. And not only that, we see that Isaac has lived, and Ishmael has lived too, quite a long while before their father dies, and yet there seems to be no relationship with them. There certainly is no named relationship with Isaac and his father after the Akedah back in chapter 22. So this is the sequence of the chronological timeline put back in the order it is, but with the text out of order. And we'll have to see in a little bit why this chapter's out of order that way. There's another interesting parallel, and that's between chapter 26 and the scene here and the scene in 1 Samuel 29. As we looked at with issues to consider, one is the relationship with 1 and 2 Samuel, and that's exactly what we see here. And the plain example is the mention of Philistines. We saw the Philistines already in chapter 21. Abimelech was the king of the Philistines there just as much as the king of the Philistines here, which is to suggest some 40 years later. We don't know how old he was there. But if you recall, or if you haven't watched it, I'll point it out to you, then we looked at the videos on chapter 20 and 21, the second wife-sister story and the situation in Gerar with Abimelech. There was a real question of who was the father of Isaac, of whether Abimelech was lying when he said he was innocent of this, or whether he was just trying to protect Abraham from scandal, in the sense that if Abimelech was the father, that would certainly be scandalous for all of them. So the text left open this strange possibility that Abimelech was Isaac's biological father, but that he ceded legal and spiritual fatherhood to Abraham in that story. So it's interesting that comes back up, and as we'll see, there's a very close connection in 26:5 to the end of the Akedah story in 22:18 that really connects these closer together, as we'll see. So what is this contrast then with David amongst the Philistines? Certainly mentioning the Philistines brings that up. Or the Abimelech of the Philistines that we see here as king is a very different situation than we see with Achish, both in 1 Samuel 27 and in 1 Samuel 29. So the parallels are, and I put it in quotes here, an Israelite, because Abraham and Isaac are not Israelites yet. It's Jacob who's the first Israel, and only his children and successors are Israelites. So he's not really an Israelite, but he's in that lineage, of course. And he comes to dwell among the Philistines, and these are the only ones who do. Another contrast I could have put up here, but I didn't, was that Isaac is doing it because Yahweh says so, and David is doing it because he's afraid of Saul. And I'll put that in here before I post this on the radicalbible.net page. The only people amongst the Israelite or Judahites who come to dwell amongst the Philistines. And in both of them, the Philistine king or the military commander, using the Hebrew sar in both places, perceive the newcomer as dangerous, perceive Isaac as dangerous because he's too wealthy and powerful, and they perceive David as too dangerous because of the song that the women sing in the streets, David has killed his tens of thousands, which the Philistines recite. So in both situations, they demand that the outsider leave. And so I already noted the contrast in power, but when David leaves, it's a tense situation. The king says, I trust you, but the commanders don't, so you have to go. And later, David will fight them. So there's no peace between them. But as Isaac leaves, Abimelech chases him down all the way to Beersheba after he's left Gerar at Abimelech's command. He finds him in Beersheba, not Bathsheba, not the subsequent wife of David, but in the city Beersheba, and enters into a border covenant, which is sealed with the ritual feast and establishes peace between them. And then we see no more strife between them at all. So perhaps, as we'll explore when we get there, there's a contrast between these two methods of being in relationship with the neighbors, either in a warlike relationship or in a bounty of the land relationship. And Isaac as a farmer is not necessarily neutral in itself. As I was noting earlier, it brings up the intratextual issue of the Garden of Eden, and perhaps the farming here that leads to the disputes over wells, as one recent scholar from Indonesia dealing with the ecological issues of water and farming notes very clearly that Isaac's farming is probably interfering with the water patterns that the Gerarites have built up over generations, and so no wonder they want him to leave. So all of those things are things we have to pay attention to as we enter into this text. And so the reason why it's out of order, I'd like to suggest, is because of the chiasm. And it's interesting how few scholars seem to note that, even though Michael Fishbane is a largely esteemed and well-established scholar, and this is from almost 3 decades ago, but recent scholarship seems to not put these pieces together. So I'm going to try to do that here. So 26 is out of order to fit into this large chiasm. If it was in reverse order, the rape of Dinah and the killing of the people in Shechem there would not fit here. These are in order. The return to Esau is followed by Jacob continuing on his journey after he refuses Esau's invitation to journey with him. And so this one is in order, and then Rachel struggles with childbirth. So to fit this into the chiasm, this one had to be put out of order. And it really highlights how the writers are engaging both the internal structure that they compose here around chiasms and the echoes they have between different texts by words and by themes. So that's a brief overview here, and next video we'll get into the Yahweh's theophany to Isaac that gives him both commands and echoes what the promises were to Abraham. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.